we're going to be talking about thought leadership, and the kind of agenda is we're first of all going to introduce our expert panelists here. So we have Matthew Yeomans, Jeremy Grant, and Matt Baldwin. Then I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so sharing with you some research we did on thought leadership. So last year we did some research amongst professional services firms about how they were doing thought leadership, what techniques they were using, what outputs, whether they were using digital outputs, and also some of the successes they were having, the KPIs they were using. And I'm going to share with you some of the highlights of that. So first of all, looking at the outputs that were produced. So 8 out of 10 are producing reports and white papers, but the second one is around articles and blogs. Social media is at 73%. So it's quite interesting, still kind of focus on actually quite traditional written outputs and thought leadership. It's interesting, actually, just in the last 5 years, we've really seen the rise of kind of infographics. And I expect that will continue. What's also interesting is what's lower down. So only 3% are using apps, 8% are using portals, 17% are using animations. And I suspect post-COVID, where we work in this virtual environment, we'll see a real explosion in the use of those, partly because we can't get the round tables and the conferences that we used to, but also because the technology has really developed in the last few years. For example, on apps, Fliplet produced some very excellent content apps. Then in terms of measures of success, the top measure is report downloads or website visits. 75% are using that as their KPI. 70% are using the number of prospect conversations they have. Again, that's going to require some sort of creativity post-COVID, is how do we ensure that we can track having those conversations with clients. It's much more challenging when you can't meet face-to-face. And also, measuring event attendance. So this sort of shift from in-person conferences and seminars towards kind of virtual events. Down at the bottom here, though, 33% are able to measure fees won. And I think that's still the nirvana for thought leadership campaigns, is how can we actually link it back to revenue? And when we asked firms how they're actually performing on this, it was still an area of relative weakness. They were really struggling to show that connection. Whereas the impact of thought leadership on boosting profile and reputation was much more effective. And then the final question, which I'm going to share with you, is around tips for success. I think what this illustrates is there's some underlying principles to good thought leadership. And 6 factors emerged. We use it as an open text question answer, and the size of the bubble represents the number of people that answered in this topic. And I think what dominates here is investing time in thinking through the strategy and the project plan. And I think this is an area where professional firms have become much more effective, certainly since we've been doing thought leadership. It's really taking time to map out, do some white space mapping, what's already been produced in this area, making sure you've got your partners on board. And we create this workshop called the Ideas Lab, which really makes sure that everyone's on one page, but almost visualizing at the end of this piece of content, what's the type of conversation you want with clients. The second factor is getting buy-in from the business. This has been a kind of classic complaint of thought leadership, is it's something that the kind of marketing function does, and then it lands on the desks of partners who are slightly inundated with the amount of content that their marketing teams are producing. So there's some real tactical things to be done here, is getting a real cohort of subject matter experts brought in right from the beginning, but also when you get to the end of a campaign, almost as much effort should go into the internal comms with partners, client relationship partners, key account teams, as it does with external. So creating a kind of Q&A type fact sheets for them. Other factors include measuring success, digestible formats for output. So here's a big shift away from the 10-page, 20-page report to a much more kind of visual way of communicating. Focusing on using research as a catalyst for client conversations, and obviously finding a unique topic, which is going to be especially difficult in the COVID when everyone is focusing on that one topic. And here's some quotes which kind of illustrate that. Start out by thinking about what conversations will take place as a result of it. What is the story? Why are people interested? How can your people talk to the market about this? Spend time planning and engaging with experts. Engage with your stakeholders from the start. You'll need them to be invested in the project later down the line. So that's kind of the fundamental principles of good thought leadership. Going forward, I think we're going to see some quite substantial changes, a shift towards more agile, pulse-type research, the growth in video content, more digital outputs such as apps and benchmarking tools. I think there's also an opportunity to create online communities of your clients where they can share experiences. And I think particularly everyone's focusing on your organization's culture and how you're representing yourself. So making sure that comes through thought leadership. And I think last but not least is getting the topics right. And I think that's what we're going to be focusing on next, is what are the topics that are going to be of interest to people.
But what I'd like to do now is I've got a number of questions that I'd like to put to the panel around three broad themes. And the first one is just looking at how and when firms are going to start planning thought leadership campaigns. And the thinking behind this question is over the last, since March, since lockdown, a lot of professional firms, their communications programs have been very much focused on the here and now, focused on what government is doing, what their clients should be doing. But already, I think COVID fatigue is beginning to set in. We probably saw that in the news over the weekend, with people beginning to avoid the official guidance. And I think as businesses move from that immediate reaction stage into recovery and then into transformation, I think it'll be quite interesting to see how thought leadership programs and campaigns reflect that. So Ben, I think maybe over to you first. I mean, what do you think firms need to think about in their autumn and winter thought leadership campaigns in terms of planning, and when should they start that planning?
So I think I totally agree with you, Matt. I think that I think we've got to sort of COVID fatigue. At the same time, I think that clients are very sort of desperate for insight to help them plan, and something which is based on real data and opinion, rather than just people kind of hypothesizing. And I think what we're seeing is we get into the recovery and transform. There's going to be some really hot topics. I think people are almost reappraising kind of what does the future of society and the economy look like. And I think what we're going to see is some acceleration of some key trends towards automation, towards greater nationalism in terms of public policy. But I think also what's really interesting is you might see some reversals and trends. So, shorter supply chains. We may see a move away from the sharing economy as people become nervous about, sharing objects with other people. I think we almost see a kind of rethinking of regulation. So we're doing a project at the moment in life sciences where we're looking at, is there going to be fundamentally a change in competition law with a view to encouraging life sciences businesses to collaborate much more. So I think it's a really fascinating time to be thinking about topics.
How do you think campaigns might differ once we move out of from a pre-COVID position? How do you think they might change and respond now?
I think there are some things that will stay the same, but will be accelerated. That's my first point. And then there's a second point, which I'll come to in a second, around being adaptive. So to the first point, was on hit. What's happening to the people in the industry that it was in, which was restaurant business and grocery and supermarket.
Jeremy, I'm really sorry, but
which was that there was a lot of
losing you.
transformation, to pick up on the word that was used a second ago. COVID merely accelerates that transformation. So you see, for example, specifically in the grocery space, there were companies that were starting to think about the whole relationship between delivery and buying pre-prepared food in supermarkets. Delivery companies like Uber Eats. Already people were starting to think about the interaction between those, because, you know, I know it may seem a long time ago, but restaurants were already really suffering COVID. The restaurant business, you know, fall in the high street was very low, except perhaps in London.
Sure.
And people were already struggling with this. Along came COVID, and that transformation agenda that they were thinking about merely got accelerated.
Matthew, why don't we move on to you? What do you think the challenges firms are going to face when creating and delivering campaigns going into the autumn term?
I think there's probably a micro element to it and a macro element to it, and I'll deal with the micro element first. And I think the micro element is the pure constraints of maybe how campaigns have played out before, previously, which have been a mixture of digital and a mixture of physical. Quite often you've seen a big thought leadership campaign be shaped around maybe a big conference speech or an event, as well as kind of maybe physical kind of literature to put in the hands of partners to go out and do kind of sales and things around the thinking. And so from kind of a tactical point of view, you know, especially around kind of the events and how you kind of deliver that, that's going to change. And so kind of companies and firms are going to have to think about, you know, basically those assets that they have and how they make the best use of them, pretty much in a digital way, rather than maybe kind of teeing up into to a physical event that might come, that would have been the payoff for them. That's kind of the micro tactical element. But I think there's a much bigger thing going on. I think the bigger thing is the culture and the sensibility that we are all coming out of COVID with. And, you know, not to get political one way or the other, we've seen that play out over this weekend. And it's a question of credibility. As brands, as firms, and as the brands that those firms give advice to, think about how they bounce back, how they meet the needs in the autumn and the winter and moving forward of society, they're going to have to win back a bit of kind of credibility. You know, that old thing, whether it was from the Spanish Civil War or World War II, you know, the question, what did your father do in the war? Those questions that were asked. The firms who come out now with this thought leadership are going to have to be able to back that up in some way. So whether that is automation, whether that is restructuring of long-term capitalism, as you know, as a number of kind of august publications and firms have suddenly been talking about, well, you actually have to say, what are you doing around that kind of stands up? So I think there's going to be a showing your credentials and demonstrating you have the skill set and the philosophy and the mindset to deliver on these big ideas.
So it's really interesting, isn't it? And I think we're beginning to see some early signs of this already in the way firms are approaching some of their campaigns already, particularly in the storytelling. And I think it seems to me it's very much firms. A lot of campaigns used to preach to their clients, and now there seems to be a softening in that. And I'm sure this has been happening for some time, but perhaps COVID is just accelerating that. And I think it's almost as if we're seeing a new humility in firms. And I think, Matthew, I'd like to come back to you again first, if that's okay. But do you think purpose will play an increasing role in thought leadership campaigns with firms?
Yes, as long as that the firms understand what purpose means for them.
Yeah.
Matthew started to touch on that, but what do you think the risks are with professional firms in this approach? And I think Matthew may have hinted at some of those.
What's the driving towards purpose? I think I think just in terms of kind of the tactics of how you plan a campaign, I think, you know, traditionally a lot of firms are going to go away in a dark room, planned out the campaign, not really spoken to clients about what's top of the agenda for them, and then kind of almost done the kind of campaign at them. And I think what I hope we're moving towards a much more sort of inclusive way, so actually consulting with clients, what are the topics of interest to you, showing that you, when you're presenting it, that this is not the definitive view of the world, because I think no one has a definitive view of the world. I think also just being kind of, rather than these kind of big campaigns that run for a year, is having much more kind of pulse type campaigns when you're sort of checking in, because the world is changing so quickly. I think I'm hoping that we're going to see quite a big change in thought leadership, which is more inclusive, more agile.
Jeremy, what I'd like to come over to you, if that's okay, and just see how can firms bring their clients into this kind of storytelling and into this new way of looking at thought leadership?
Yeah. Well, I think Ben makes an excellent point, and it gets to this. It's not a new idea, but it's this whole idea of co-creating your thought leadership with clients, which is this collaborative approach, which is less preachy and has a bit more humility, to pick up on an earlier point, I think. There are still too few professional services firms, I think, that do this. And I think now is the moment for this to happen properly, because there will be a plethora of stories that come out of these months of COVID, this year of COVID really, that can be used usefully in thought leadership to cope in terms of co-creating with clients, to produce this kind of, I wouldn't say softer content, but I like that word that was used earlier on, the sort of softer approach. But I think at the same time, one point I wanted to make was around a quote, the word adaptive that I used earlier on. And it gets to this whole idea that let's park the idea for the moment that thought leadership will be more collaborative and with clients. I think it will be, and it should be, but what should the content be about? And I think that because we have COVID fatigue, and I don't mean that in terms of, you know, the disease and the dreadful news stories and facts of the matter. I mean in terms of the, you know, people trying to come up with pointy-headed things to say about it in terms of thought leadership. It's about who's adaptive and who can adapt fastest. I was on a very interesting webcast the other day by Tortoise Media. For those of you who know Tortoise, those of you who don't, it's a new news organization set up about a year ago by a guy called James Harding, who used to be the BBC news editor and was a colleague of mine at the FT. And Thomas Friedman, the New York Times columnist, was on, and he said something I think quite simple and quite profound, which is very applicable to the practitioners of thought leadership. And he was talking about who Mother Nature rewards. Mother Nature does not reward the smartest, the strongest, or the richest. She only rewards the most adaptive. I thought that was an amazingly succinct and useful takeaway, which I thought I'd throw out there for practitioners of thought leadership. It's this: the people who will be rewarded in the next year or so are those who are the most adaptive thought leadership. And that's, I think, a key point here.
I think you're absolutely right, and actually it sort of nicely segues into the third sort of theme I wanted to sort of touch on in a way, is that I think firms will be looking for much more from their thought leadership and the budgets that they're going to be spending on thought leadership. And looking to get the most out of their campaigns. And again, Jeremy, maybe if I come back to you, is with looking at the most rewarding campaigns are those that tend to have a degree of longevity to them. And how do you build into a campaign that longevity into a campaign? And perhaps, and how important will that be with those firms where budgets are perhaps going to be a little bit tighter and they're wanting to get more bang for their buck from campaigns. What sort of advice and tips would you give to firms looking to when they're planning their campaigns?
Well, longevity will be defined very often by how unique your topic is. There is nothing more off-putting and nothing more sure to turn people off and stop them viewing and stop them clicking and click-through rates and what have you than a topic that they've seen before. And you want to avoid an echo chamber, obviously, and everybody in this call probably knows that already. I'm not telling everybody, this is not a hugely insightful comment, but I think it's certainly worth repeating at a time like this. So everybody wants to know the answer to the question, what do I do next? Whether they're a finance director, a strategy director, a brand manager, a CEO, everybody wants to know what is going to be around the corner, what will the world look like? And I think if you can find an interesting angle on that and a way to approach it on a repeat basis across sectors, let's say, or on a repeat basis within the rubric of transformation, let's say, then you start to have something to say. It's not easy, this, and this is a question which gets asked all the time on these kinds of calls, and when we had them in physically, it's how are you unique? How do you prolong your message? How do you keep people interested? It's a constant battle. It's a kind of Sisyphean task, really, rolling that rock up the hill, I have to say. It is very necessary, though, because I think probably people would accept that at the moment, the way where we've got to with thought leadership in the last 8-10 years now, perhaps 5 years, is that there are too many firms that occupy a kind of fat, happy waistline of mediocrity with their content. I'm being very blunt here, but it's true. And you see it in the way the thought leadership is assessed. Nobody is being bold enough, heads above the parapet, and indeed take a topic and really deal with it in an interesting and perhaps even provocative way. That's how you get longevity. It's about time some firms stepped up and did that. Chris,
I'm going to. I think that's a really interesting place to draw it to a close. But I'm going to put one final question to you all, and maybe to take on Jeremy's challenge. There is what particular piece of theme or thought leadership campaign would you like to see come out of some professional services firms over the next sort of 12 months that really elevates the campaign, as Jeremy sort of indicated? And Matthew, I'm going to pick on you first there. Make it easy on the other two.
Oh, thanks. That's really nice. I wish my internet had stayed down now. Look, there are big. I think I touched on. There are big themes that professional services firms will have a major role in playing over the next kind of over the next number of years, and they are core to some of the services and some of the consultancies they're doing, and the future of work in an area where suddenly our whole working life has been shaken up is going to be a core one. Automation, if I read another thought leadership piece about, for every job that's lost to robotics, we'll be creating another great one. Well, tell that to a whole group of society over the next 3 months. I'd like to see that really well thought through and some answers come through. How do we go that? And how do we do that? But also maybe we need to be starting thinking even broader than that, and to pick up on Jeremy's point, to be provocative, but actually to take the leadership bit in these thoughts of how do we create a society that maybe doesn't have as many people working for it as it physically did before, and how now that we've done kind of a soft launch, if you want, of everyone sitting at home and looking and thinking and having more time to be creative. How did that feel for everyone? And what does that mean for our society moving forward? I'd like to see that one looked at.
Pretty impressive. Jeremy, I think Matthew may have stolen pretty much all the good ideas there, but any campaigns that you particularly like to see?
I'm gonna come at it with perhaps a little bit of a left field approach, but one point I think is worth making here is that while I absolutely agree that we're in a period of needing to build credibility, a new humility, the word trust is absolutely critical. You only have to look at what happened at the weekend in British politics to understand how vitally important that is this. We have to also recognize that, unfortunately, in the business world, there is this thing called animal spirits. And when we start, we're already, I know from internal discussions that there are certain clients, particularly in the financial services space, that are thinking about opportunities for, how the world will look when the winners and losers appear when the tide has gone out. And it's the same for other large businesses. Let's not kid ourselves. Business is still business and finance is still finance. There are people who are looking to take advantage of this creative destruction, shall we say, that has been presented. And there's M&A, people who are looking at M&A. You just have to look at what's happening in fintech and look at what happened with the valuation of Revolut and Monzo. I mean, you're going to have a shakeout in the fintech space. Well, how that is done, and my long-winded way of saying my main point, which is the clever thought leadership will be that which tackles the animal spirit side of it, which we have to recognize is going to be there when the economy starts to come back even more. With this combined with this humility, trust, credibility thing, and more effectively a kind of more responsive capitalism, really what it links to. That would be a clever way, I think, of approaching things.
And that sounds like a pretty epic challenge. Ben, final word to you.
I totally agree with what you said. I think now is the time to think big. I think everyone's in a reflective mood, essentially what's the kind of future of capitalism. But I think that we got that big level. I also think people are desperate for people who've actually been there and done it. People running businesses who are having success, are saving their business, because there's so much kind of hype and talk. I think something about the business leaders and the successes they're having would be people would love, I think.